On June 6, 1944, at 9:45 in the morning, Colonel General Alfred Jodl paused before the entrance to the main hall of the Berghof, raising his hand to rap on the wood before hesitating and lowering it again. Behind the general, two subordinates stood waiting, the color drained from their faces. No sound or motion could be detected through the thick timber of the door, because the Führer was still asleep. Jodl had been up for 4 hours, having received the initial alerts at 5:30 that morning. The notifications described thousands of paratroopers descending upon Normandy, followed by heavy naval shelling, and then the landing craft carrying Americans, British, and Canadians hitting the shores in seemingly infinite waves. Yet here he remained, paralyzed outside a bedroom, too terrified to knock. He was not alone in this apprehension, for every officer at the Berghof understood the protocol. The Führer had ingested his sedatives the previous evening and never rose before 10 o'clock, and frequently not until 11. Any individual who disrupted his rest risked a violent outburst that could destroy a career or lead to even worse consequences. Jodl had witnessed officers transferred to the Eastern Front for minor infractions, and had known others who simply vanished. However, this situation was unique. This was the invasion. Jodl knocked, initially with a soft touch, then with more force. There was no response. He struck the wood again, announcing that there was critical intelligence from France. Still, there was silence. The sleeping draughts Hitler consumed were potent, a mixture of barbiturates prescribed by his personal doctor, Theo Morel, which induced a slumber so profound that even the roar of artillery at forward command posts failed to wake him. Jodl pounded on the door. Minutes ticked by until finally there was a shuffling noise and a curse from within. The door swung open to reveal Hitler in his nightshirt, his hair disheveled and his face swollen with sleep and annoyance. Although he was 54 years old, he appeared much simpler and older in that instant, his complexion sallow and his eyes fighting to focus. He warned Jodl that the news had better be significant. Jodl reported that the invasion had commenced in Normandy, detailing the multiple beach landings, the inland airborne drops, and the naval bombardment happening at that very moment. Hitler gazed at him for 3 or 4 seconds in silence. Suddenly, his expression shifted, not into alarm or shock, but into a different emotion entirely. His eyes became sharp, and his mouth curled into a look that resembled a smile of gratification. He remarked that the Allies had finally revealed their intentions. Turning back into the room and leaving the door ajar, he allowed Jodl to follow. Hitler moved to the window, clasping his hands behind his back as he looked out at the Bavarian Alps bathed in morning light. He mused that it was Normandy rather than Calais, which he found interesting. Jodl remained silent, knowing better than to intrude on Hitler's contemplation. Outside, the mountains were pristine and quiet, completely detached from the violence erupting 700 meters away to the west. Birds were singing, and a dog barked in the distance. The war seemed incredibly remote. Hitler eventually declared it a feint, concluding that the enemy wanted Germany to commit its reserves to Normandy so they could launch the true invasion at the Pas de Calais. He insisted that Calais made the most sense due to it being the shortest crossing and closest point to Germany. He believed Eisenhower was attempting a clever ruse. Jodl held the reports, which he had reviewed 3 times. The sheer magnitude of the Normandy operation did not suggest a diversion. There were thousands of vessels and aircraft, along with airborne divisions deployed behind the coast. However, Hitler was already preparing himself, dressing and summoning his adjutants. He demanded the latest intelligence and ordered Keitel to report, insisting they must assess the scenario thoroughly before committing any forces. That specific word, commit, sent a chill through Jodl. The Panzer divisions, specifically the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend near Lisieux and the Panzer Lehr Division near Le Mans, were positioned within striking range of the beaches. Both were primed to mobilize, yet both required authorization that only Hitler could grant. Now fully uniformed, Hitler was actually smiling. He told Jodl that this scenario could be ideal. If the Allies had committed their main force to Normandy, the Germans could destroy them there, crushing them on the sands and driving them back into the ocean to prove that Fortress Europe was impenetrable. The morning briefing commenced at 10:30, by which time additional reports had confirmed the invasion was not decelerating, but widening. 5 distinct landing zones were identified: Utah Beach on the Cotentin Peninsula, Omaha Beach, where Americans were pushing forward despite murderous defensive fire, and Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, where British and Canadian troops were driving inland. Paratroopers had seized vital bridges and intersections behind the coast, while naval guns were systematically obliterating German fortifications. Hitler stood at the map table listening, occasionally querying the numbers. The ship count was impossible to verify, with reports citing hundreds or perhaps over 1,000. The sky was reported to be dark with aircraft, as Allied air superiority was total. Estimates of troops ashore varied, climbing past 50,000 by noon, then 70,000, and continuing to rise. Yet Hitler adhered to his conclusion that the Allies were preserving their true strength for Calais. He argued that Normandy was too obvious and expected, noting that Rommel himself had predicted it, which was precisely why the real invasion would not happen there. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West, telephoned from his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, outside Paris. 70 years old, and a Prussian officer of the old breed, his voice held the authority of 4 decades of service. He requested permission to mobilize the Panzer reserves toward the landing zones, warning that every hour of delay allowed the enemy to strengthen their beachhead. Hitler refused immediately, insisting they needed to see the enemy's full hand first, fearing that committing the tanks to Normandy would leave them defenseless against a primary assault at Calais. When von Rundstedt tried to emphasize the scale of the operation, Hitler cut him off, citing British deception skills and recalling the dummy tanks at El Alamein and false radio signals. He declared they would not be deceived. Von Rundstedt, 700 kilometers away, stood silent in his headquarters before telling his chief of staff that Hitler was going to allow the enemy to establish themselves. However, the field marshal was incorrect on one point. Hitler was not granting the Allies time due to indecision, but because he genuinely believed he was outsmarting them by waiting to spring a trap. By early afternoon, the statistics were irrefutable, with over 100,000 Allied soldiers ashore. German commanders in Normandy were begging for reinforcements. The 21st Panzer Division, the solely available armored unit, had counterattacked toward Sword Beach, but was halted by British anti-tank defenses and naval artillery. The division commander stated that without massive support, the beachhead could not be erased. Hitler's reaction was to order them to hold and contain the enemy without committing the reserve panzers. Jodl attempted to reason with him again, but Hitler pointed to the map, arguing that Calais was 120 miles from London and 150 miles from the Ruhr industrial heartland. whereas Normandy was over 200 and 300 miles away, respectively. He added that Calais possessed the superior ports, while Normandy's were too small or fortified. Strategically, he argued, Normandy made no sense as the main invasion point. His logic was internally consistent, but factually wrong. Hitler had constructed his worldview on the notion that his intuition surpassed the conventional thinking of his generals. He had been right about France in 1940 and the Soviet Union in 1941, defying the odds. This history of success made him certain of his genius. Consequently, the panzers remained stationary while the Allies continued to land and the beachhead grew. By evening, the troop count exceeded 120,000. The landing zones were linking up, and Allied forces had pushed inland between 2 and 5 miles in some sectors, capturing Bayeux and securing the port at Courseulles. The beachhead had evolved from a toehold to a foothold. That evening, Hitler dined in the Berghof surrounded by staff and guests, the conversation surprisingly mundane, touching on opera and factory production. He seemed relaxed, only mentioning the invasion once to say that within a week the real attack would come, vindicating his decision to hold back the reserves. Across the table, an aide with a report in his pocket sat silently. The latest estimate was 140,000 troops, a number expected to surpass 150,000 by midnight. No one spoke of it. That night in Normandy, the Allied position was roughly 10 miles wide and 3 to 5 miles deep. Over 156,000 men were ashore, matching the figure history would later record. They brought tanks, artillery, and thousands of vehicles, establishing hospitals and command posts. While they were still organizing and vulnerable, the panzer reserves that could have struck them sat motionless, awaiting orders that never arrived. Hitler retired that night, convinced he had made the correct choice. The following day, June 7th, saw the beachhead expand further as more troops and supplies landed. The Allies captured villages and secured defensive lines, while Hitler continued to restrain the panzers. It was not until June 8th, 2 full days after the initial landings, that he authorized some reserve units to move toward Normandy. He did this not because he had changed his mind about Calais, but because the situation in Normandy had deteriorated too severely to ignore. He released only a portion of the units, keeping substantial forces waiting for the phantom invasion at Calais. By then, it was too late. Allied air superiority was so absolute that German columns moving by day were decimated. The panzers had to travel at night, arriving piecemeal and too weak to launch a decisive counterattack. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, had been away on June 6th celebrating his wife's birthday in Germany, believing the weather precluded an invasion. He raced back, arriving on June 7th to a critical situation. His defensive strategy had relied on immediate panzer counterattacks, a plan destroyed by Hitler's hesitation. On June 9th, Rommel sent a blunt message to Hitler, stating that without the full commitment of the reserves, the beachhead could not be eliminated. Hitler replied the same day, ordering him to hold and contain until the situation clarified. Rommel realized Hitler still expected an attack at Calais and was waiting until it was too late. Hitler's belief that Normandy was a diversion persisted for weeks. Even as the Allies broke out toward Paris, he kept forces near Calais to counter an invasion that existed only in his imagination, a testament to the success of the Allied deception, Operation Fortitude. On June 17, 1944, Hitler met Rommel and von Rundstedt at a bunker near Margival in his first visit to France since 1940. He arrived by car to avoid Allied fighters. The meeting was hostile. Rommel explained that the Allies had 500,000 troops in France and controlled a beachhead 60 miles wide. He argued that German forces were being ground down by overwhelming firepower. Hitler responded that the solution was to hold every meter of ground and turn every position into a fortress. When von Rundstedt argued that this would destroy the army, Hitler became enraged, accusing them of wanting to surrender France. He shouted that they must hold everything and that retreat was forbidden. When Rommel suggested a political solution to negotiate peace with the West to fight the Soviets, Hitler exploded, declaring there was no political solution, only victory or death. The meeting ended with Hitler railing against defeatism and promising new weapons like the V-1 and V-2 rockets and jet fighters. The generals left knowing nothing had changed. In Normandy, the battle of attrition continued. Despite fighting brilliantly, the Germans faced overwhelming odds. 5 Allied tanks for every one of theirs, 20 aircraft to 1, and 50 shells fired for every German response. Hitler viewed this as a test of will, believing the enemy would collapse if hit hard enough. On July 20, 1944, an assassination attempt by German officers failed, leaving Hitler with minor injuries but absolute paranoia. He saw treason everywhere and purged the military, imprisoning or executing thousands. Meanwhile, the front collapsed. On July 25th, the Americans launched Operation Cobra, breaking out of Normandy. Paris fell in August, and by September the Allies neared Germany. Hitler blamed betrayal and incompetence for the defeat, never his own refusal to allow withdrawals or his decision on June 6th to withhold the panzers. Historians generally agree that even with perfect German decisions, D-Day would likely have succeeded due to Allied material dominance, though the cost would have been higher. Hitler's choices determined the speed and completeness of the victory. Until his death in the Berlin bunker in April 1945, Hitler never accepted his responsibility, always blaming others for failing his genius. On the morning of June 6th, he had believed he was seeing through a deception and holding the winning hand. He was wrong. The game was lost before he realized it had begun. 156,000 troops were ashore, and the liberation of Europe was underway. The man who trusted his intuition above all else had made the catastrophic decision with absolute certainty, leading his nation to ruin while believing he was leading it to glory. He had chosen to trust his assumptions over reality, and by the time he understood the truth, it was far too late.